Joining me now is the Secretary of State of Colorado, Jena Griswold, who was named a party in the 14th Amendment case that the Supreme Court heard on Thursday. And also with us is Noah Bookbinder, president of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, an organization that filed the lawsuit on behalf of Colorado voters. Noah, thank you for being with me this morning. The justices really did seem skeptical about this case. Many of the court watchers, including myself, tend to think that there's a good chance that Trump is going to be allowed to stay on the ballot. You probably watched this, I'm assuming. What did you think? How do you think it went?
Well, look, we always knew that the Supreme Court was going to have a lot of tough questions for us. What we were asking them to do is extraordinary, right? So we were asking that a former president, a leading presidential candidate, one of the major parties, be removed from the ballot. But of course, in American history, we've also never had a president himself in power after losing an election, including by inciting a violent insurrection. So of course, there were going to be a lot of tough questions. There were tough questions. We know a lot of those were aimed at us because what we were asking was so extraordinary. The other side is just asking for the status quo. We're very hopeful that when the court goes back and looks at the briefs in front of it, thinks through the answers from Thursday, that they're going to come to the same conclusion that we did, which is that the law is actually very, very clear that Donald Trump has to be disqualified. This provision is good law. It applies to presidents. It has to be enforceable the way that we enforce our election laws.
Jena, I want to play a clip for you from the actual hearings where Justice Elena Kagan questioned why Colorado, or any state for that matter, should actually influence the presidential race. Let's listen to this.
I think that the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. In other words, this question of whether a former president is disqualified for insurrection to be president again is, just say it. It sounds awfully national to me.
Now, Secretary, there has been a lot of conversation about the notion of election interference, but what do you make of that question from Justice Kagan, and what's your response?
Truly, I think it's a surprising, almost borderline shocking question that the justices are indicating that they're looking at political outcomes in interpreting the Constitution. It also shows a misunderstanding about how elections work. There are oftentimes in national elections candidates who are on some states' ballots and not on other states, including in this presidential primary, with a candidate who has petitioned some states and been kept off other states' ballots because he is not a natural-born citizen. And I just think extending the reasoning of the justice, if the point we're looking at is whether a policy in a state can affect a national election, then they should be looking at the voter suppression laws all across this nation. What about Georgia? What if Georgia's voter suppression laws targeting African-American voters in Atlanta decide the national presidential election? Does that mean the Supreme Court is going to go into Georgia? So I would just say I was very surprised. And if they're going to go down this path, then I think it opens up a whole can of worms for the Supreme Court. And if it opens the can of worms of stopping voter suppression laws, well, I think that would be a good outcome.
I think that when you talk about voter suppression laws and what we're looking at big picture wise, it makes me really question the what if. And Noah, I'm going to ask you about that. What if the Supreme Court says, look, we're going to leave him on the ballot, but we are going to be very specific in our opinion as to what needs to happen in order to invoke Section 3 in the future? Is that a win? Is that a win for the American people if there is greater definition and specificity applied by the court, such that should this happen again, or should we find ourselves in a space where this is occurring again, that there won't be this confusion? Do you walk away with a win from that?
I think there are a number of ways that we can have a result that we see as winning this case. One is obviously we still think that we can simply win and have Donald Trump removed from the ballot. Another is that, I think something that was very striking on Thursday is that for all the skepticism that we heard, there was very little skepticism of the finding that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. If the Supreme Court leaves that in place in any form, that would be a tremendous win in terms of the American people understanding what happened and where Donald Trump stands with relation to the Constitution. But the other thing that this case was about was preserving for the future the right to the constitutional protection that disqualifies people who attack the democracy and could do it again. And one of the things that our very brave plaintiffs in this case felt was that if we didn't use it here, we might never be able to use it in the future. And so if the Supreme Court does provide a clear path forward for using this provision to protect the republic, to protect the democracy in the future from people like Donald Trump, who engage in insurrection, who attack the democracy, that most certainly would be a positive outcome as well.
I think that the notion of accountability is one that has been circling this discussion from its very outset in terms of looking at potential outcomes. Jenna, you've talked about the notion of accountability and hoping that the Supreme Court holds Donald Trump accountable. If this case does not move forward and he is kept on the ballot, could the immunity decision being struck down or being upheld, rather, the notion that Donald Trump does not have, like any other president, blanket immunity, do you see that as potentially a vehicle or a pathway to accountability for former President Donald Trump or for future presidents?
He has a lot to be accountable for. Donald Trump acts like a mob boss. He acts like he's above the law, above the Constitution, and has the gall to lie to the Supreme Court about his role in the insurrection. Make no mistake, we are only here having this conversation. We were only at the United States Supreme Court because Donald Trump lost. He did not accept that result and incited a violent mob, sent Congress people running for their lives, had supporters, rioters, storm the Capitol, some with the intention of hanging his own vice president to steal the 2020 election. And it was just part of his plot. I think Donald Trump has quite a bit to be accountable to. And Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is in the Constitution for this exact scenario. It underlines that insurrectionists are dangerous when they're in office, that if they gain office again, they are able to destroy democracy from within. So I do hope that the Supreme Court justices understand the bigger picture. I do hope that they're thinking about what a second Trump term would look like, the effects of what that would have on our democracy. But ultimately, this is not a Supreme Court that has been friendly to voting rights or democracy. And it will be very likely up to the American people this November to stop insurrectionists and protect our democracy.
Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold and Noah Bookbinder, thank you both for getting us started on a Saturday morning.